Summer 1943. Luftwaffe bomber crews climbed into their aircraft confident that darkness and altitude would shield them from British defenses. German intelligence dismissed Allied Funkmeschrat as primitive experimental equipment, crude radio direction finders at best. They had no idea that every aircraft was being tracked with pinpoint accuracy from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast. British chain-home radar wasn't theoretical. It was operational, networked, and devastatingly effective. While German commanders debated whether practical airborne radar was even possible, RAF night fighters equipped with AI Mk.IV were vectoring directly onto Luftwaffe bombers in total darkness. The shock came not in a single battle, but in mounting inexplicable losses that shattered German confidence in their entire strategic bombing doctrine.
They saw it from 800 yards through the gunner's periscope. A Tiger, holed down behind a stone wall near the crossroads outside Eracourt, its 88mm gun already traversing toward their position. Staff Sergeant James Bates, commanding an M4A3 Sherman of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would define whether he and his crew lived through the next minute. It was September 29, 1944. The autumn rain had turned the fields of Lorraine into a maze of mud and hedgerows. Bates had been in France since July, had fought through the breakout from Normandy, had seen what German armor could do. His Sherman mounted the new 76mm gun, not the stubby 75, that had proven inadequate against heavy German tanks. He had exactly 4 rounds of the special ammunition, the hypervelocity armor-piercing shot that ordnance officers said could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. 4 rounds. No one had told him if it actually worked in combat. No one really knew. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German commander would be making his own calculations. He had frontal armor 100mm thick, face-hardened steel that had stopped every American 75mm round fired at it from the front since Tigers first appeared in Tunisia 18 months earlier. German tank doctrine was built on this fundamental assumption. Frontally, the Tiger was immune to American tank guns at combat ranges. It could sit in position, take hits, and methodically destroy every Sherman that appeared. The mathematics had proven this in battle after battle. Tigers killed Shermans at ranges where Shermans could not harm Tigers. But Bates had the 76, and the German commander, watching the Sherman through his optics, would be making a critical assumption based on experience. He would assume he had time to aim carefully, time to ensure a first-round hit, because American tanks did not threaten Tigers from the front. This was established fact, verified through hundreds of engagements across 2 years of combat. Bates gave the order. His gunner, Corporal Robert Chen, who had trained on this weapon for exactly 3 weeks, centered the crosshairs on the Tiger's glacis plate. The loader slammed home one of the precious hypervelocity rounds. The gun fired. The recoil rocked the Sherman backwards in its suspension. Through the smoke and the rain they watched for the impact. What happened in the next 2 seconds would represent something more than a single engagement between 2 tanks. It would represent the moment when a fundamental assumption of armored warfare on the Western Front began to crack. The Tiger's invincibility from the front, the tactical certainty that had governed German defensive. Doctrine, the psychological advantage that came from knowing your armor would protect you. All of it rested on the proven inability of American guns to penetrate face-hardened steel at combat ranges. The hypervelocity round struck the Tiger's upper glacis at 2,800 feet per second. The question that had obsessed American ordnance officers for months, the question that German intelligence had not yet fully grasped, was about to be answered, was now being resolved in a shower of sparks and fractured steel at a muddy crossroads in eastern France. To understand what was about to change, you must first understand what German tank crews believed about their armor and why they believed it so completely. The Tiger WWII, officially designated Panzerkampfwagen 6 und Tiger Ausführung I, entered service in August 1942. It was not designed as a breakthrough tank or a pursuit vehicle. It was designed as a mobile fortress, a defensive anchor point that could dominate entire sectors of the battlefield through firepower and protection. The tank weighed 54 tons in combat configuration. Its armor was simple, vertical, and thick. 100 millimeters on the frontal hull, 120 millimeters on the turret front, 80 millimeters on the sides. The steel was face-hardened through a process that created an extremely hard outer surface layer while leaving the interior core relatively soft. This made the armor highly resistant to penetration. When a projectile struck face-hardened armor, if it lacked sufficient energy, it would shatter against the hard outer layer without penetrating. The armor would crack, spall, or dent, but it would not fail catastrophically. The crew inside would feel the impact, would see the inner surface bulge slightly, might catch fragments of spalling steel, but they would survive, and the tank would continue fighting. German crews learned this through experience. In North Africa, British 75 millimeter guns bounced off Tiger armor repeatedly. In Russia, Soviet 76 millimeter guns proved inadequate against frontal armor at any reasonable combat range. Only the Soviet 85 millimeter gun, or specialized anti-tank guns, firing tungsten core ammunition posed serious frontal threats, and even those required specific angles and ranges. When Tigers first encountered American Sherman tanks in Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943, the pattern repeated. The Sherman's 75 millimeter M3 gun, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate 60 millimeters of face-hardened armor at 500 yards. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. The mathematics were straightforward. At combat ranges, Sherman fire from the front was survivable. Concerning, certainly. Frightening, absolutely. But survivable. German tactical doctrine evolved around this reality. Tigers were employed as defensive anchors, positioned, hull down in prepared positions where their frontal armor faced the enemy. They would wait for American armor to advance, would absorb the initial shots, would methodically engage and destroy the attackers. The 88 millimeter KWK-36 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Sherman had to close to within 500 yards and maneuver for side shots to have any chance of destroying a Tiger. This was not theoretical. This was proven in combat across every theater where Tigers and Shermans met. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, a single Tiger commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed approximately 14 tanks and 15 personnel carriers in 15 minutes. The British Cromwell and Sherman tanks involved could not penetrate his frontal armor. He could destroy them at will. This engagement became legendary in German armored forces, not because it was unusual, but because it was exemplary. It demonstrated what a well-positioned Tiger could accomplish against numerically superior but technologically inferior opposition. American ordnance officers understood the problem well before the invasion of France. Reports from North Africa and Italy made it clear. The 75 millimeter gun was inadequate against heavy German armor. Combat after action reports documented the pattern repeatedly. Sherman units would encounter Tigers or Panthers. They would maneuver for flank shots because frontal penetration was impossible. They would lose tanks in the process. The kill-loss ratios were unacceptable. The solution was not simple. You could not merely install a larger gun in the existing Sherman turret. The turret ring diameter limited what could be mounted. The recoil forces from a heavier gun would require redesigned components. The ammunition would be larger, reducing the number of rounds carried. The increased weight would affect performance. Every change cascaded into a dozen additional modifications. The Ordnance Department began development of a new 76mm gun in 1942. The weapon was designated the 76mm gun M1. It had a longer barrel than the 75mm M3, 52 calibers in length compared to 40 calibers. This increased the muzzle velocity significantly. Where the 75mm fired its armor-piercing round at 2,030 feet per second, the 76mm achieved 2,600 feet per second with standard ammunition. The increased velocity meant increased penetration. Standard 76mm M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition could penetrate 92 millimeters of face-hardened armor at 500 yards, 30 degrees from vertical. This was a substantial improvement over the 75mm, 60mm under the same conditions, but it was still insufficient against Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges. The Aish 100mm glasses, angled at 9 degrees from vertical, presented an effective thickness of approximately 102 millimeters. The standard 76mm ammunition remained inadequate for frontal penetration. The real breakthrough came with the development of hypervelocity armor-piercing ammunition, designated M93. This round used a tungsten carbide core, a much harder material than the steel used in standard armor-piercing shot. The tungsten core, enclosed in a lighter aluminum or steel body, achieved muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. At 500 yards, the M93 round could penetrate 109 millimeters of face-hardened armor at 30 degrees. This meant, theoretically, it could defeat Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges. The critical word was theoretically. Penetration tables were derived from controlled testing at proving grounds. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland tested ammunition against armor plates mounted on stands, fired from fixed positions at measured distances. The conditions were optimal. The armor plates were of known composition and hardness. The ammunition was manufactured to exact specifications. The results were repeatable and could be tabulated with precision. Combat was different. Armor plates on tanks were welded together, creating stress points and variations in hardness. Tanks were moving, or had recently moved, creating vibrations that affected aiming. Ranges were estimated, not measured. Ammunition varied slightly in manufacturing quality. Environmental factors, temperature, humidity, mud on the optics affected outcomes. What worked at Aberdeen might not work at Ericourt, and no one would know until someone tried it under fire against an actual Tiger that was shooting back. The 76mm gun Sherman entered production in January 1944 at the Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal. The initial variant was the M4A1 76W, where the W designation indicated wet ammunition storage, a modification intended to reduce the catastrophic fires that had plagued earlier Sherman models. The gun was mounted in a new turret design, larger than the original, with a distinctive bustle at the rear for radio equipment and ammunition storage. Production figures tell the story of American industrial capacity. In January 1944, the Detroit Arsenal produced 61 Shermans mounting the 76mm gun. By March, production had increased to 214 tanks. By June, concurrent with the Normandy invasion, production reached 343 units. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, began parallel production. By the end of 1944, American factories would produce over 4,000 Sherman tanks mounting the 76mm gun in various configurations. But production and deployment were different matters. The initial batches of 76mm Shermans arrived in England in May 1944, weeks before the invasion. Armored division commanders examined them with mixed reactions. Some recognized the improved anti-armor capability as essential. Others worried about the reduced high-explosive ammunition load. From 97 rounds in the 75mm Sherman to 71 rounds in the 76mm variant. Since most Sherman combat involved supporting infantry against fortifications and troops in the open rather than engaging enemy armor, the reduced high-explosive capacity seemed like a poor trade. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, was among those who requested the new tanks. His battalion had trained extensively in England and Scotland, preparing for armored exploitation following the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Abrams understood that German armor doctrine emphasized defensive positions using heavy tanks. If his battalion encountered Tigers or Panthers in prepared positions, the 75mm gun would force his Shermans to maneuver for flank shots, exposing them to German fire. The 76mm offered at least the possibility of frontal engagement. The crews who would operate these weapons received abbreviated training. Gunners trained on the new gun for 2 to 3 weeks, learning the ballistics, the sight picture, the recoil characteristics. The 76mm gun recoiled differently than the 75. The longer barrel changed the tank's balance slightly. The turret, being larger and heavier, rotated with different inertia. These were not major differences, but they were enough to require familiarization. The critical limitation was ammunition. The M93 hypervelocity, armor-piercing shot, the tungsten core round that could theoretically penetrate Tiger armor, was in desperately short supply. Tungsten was a strategic material needed for machine tools, aircraft engines, and armor-piercing ammunition across all theaters. The Manhattan Project was consuming tungsten for specialized applications. The available supply was limited, and distribution was controlled at the highest levels of the Army Ordnance Department. In July 1944, when the 4th Armored Division moved into France following the breakout from Normandy, each 76mm Sherman carried approximately 4 to 6 M93 hypervelocity rounds among its total load of 71 rounds. The remainder were standard M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition, high explosive, white phosphorus smoke, and canister anti-personnel rounds. Crews were instructed to conserve the hypervelocity ammunition for heavy armor targets only. They were not to waste it on reconnaissance vehicles, half-tracks, or fortifications. Only Tigers, Panthers, and possibly the newer Panther variants justified using the scarce tungsten core ammunition. This created a psychological burden for tank commanders. In combat, you had seconds to identify targets, assess threats, and make firing decisions. You had to determine whether the tank 700 yards away, partially obscured by smoke and terrain, was a Panther that justified using hypervelocity ammunition or a Panzer IV that could be engaged with standard rounds. Make the wrong choice. Waste a hypervelocity round on a lesser target, and you might lack it when a Tiger appeared. Hesitate to use the hypervelocity ammunition, engage a Panther with standard rounds that bounce off, and your crew might die while you deliberated. The crews adapted. They learned to identify German armor at distance by silhouette, by the sound of the engines, by the tactical behavior. Panthers moved aggressively. Tigers held defensive positions. Panzer IVs operated in support roles. These were generalizations, often wrong, but they were the best available heuristics for making split-second decisions about ammunition selection. The engagement at Ericourt began not with a single dramatic encounter, but with a series of running battles across several days in late September 1944. General George Patton's Third Army had advanced rapidly across France following the breakout from Normandy. By mid-September, Patton's forces had reached the Moselle River in Lorraine, approaching the German border. The advance was slowing, constrained by fuel shortages and stiffening German resistance. The 4th Armored Division, part of the WWII Corps, was positioned near the town of Aricourt, a crossroads settlement in rolling agricultural terrain. German forces, recognizing the threat to their defensive line, launched a counteroffensive on September 19th using the 5th Panzer Army. The German force included the 113th Panzer Brigade, equipped with Panther tanks and elements of other armored units, including some Tiger tanks held in reserve. The terrain favored defensive operations. Stone walls lined fields. Small villages provided cover. The autumn rain had softened the ground, creating mud that channeled vehicle movement to roads and elevated ground. German commanders positioned their armor to control the key crossroads and deny American forces freedom of maneuver. Staff Sergeant James Bates and his crew, operating Sherman No. 304 of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, encountered the Tiger near Aricourt on September 29th. The engagement was not planned. Bates was leading a section of 3 Shermans conducting a reconnaissance sweep along a secondary road when his driver spotted the Tiger approximately 800 yards ahead, hull down behind a stone wall. The German crew had selected their position carefully. The Tiger's frontal armor faced the American approach. The hull was protected by the stone wall and terrain. Only the turret was exposed, presenting a minimal target. The 88-millimeter gun had clear fields of fire along the road and across the adjacent fields. Bates had perhaps 3 seconds before the German gunner acquired his tank and fired. The Tiger's optical rangefinder, superior to American equipment, would give the German gunner an accurate range estimate. The Tiger's gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at this distance with near certainty. First-round hit probability for a well-trained German crew at 800 yards against a stationary target was approximately 70%. Bates made his decision. He would not attempt to maneuver for a flank shot. The terrain did not favor it, and movement would expose his tank to fire. He would not retreat, which would expose his thinner rear armor and potentially abandon his mission. He would engage frontally using one of his 4 hypervelocity rounds and trust that the ordnance tables were correct. His gunner, Corporal Robert Chen, had trained for 3 weeks on this weapon. He had fired perhaps 20 practice rounds at Aberdeen Proving Ground before the battalion shipped to England. He had never fired a hypervelocity round at an actual enemy tank. He centered his sight reticle on the Tiger's glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor where the hull met the fighting compartment. The range was 800 yards, estimated by eye. The ammunition was M93, hypervelocity, armor-piercing, tungsten core. The loader confirmed the round was seated. Chen made a final sight correction for range and wind. Bates gave the order to fire. The 76-millimeter gun recoiled. The tungsten core projectile left the barrel at 2,930 feet per second. Flight time to target at 800 yards was approximately 0.8 of a second. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The projectile struck the Tiger's upper glacis plate slightly left of center. The impact velocity at 800 yards was approximately 2,600 feet per second. The tungsten carbide core, harder than the face-hardened steel armor, did not shatter on impact. It began to penetrate. The physics of armor penetration are brutal. The tungsten core, traveling at hypersonic velocity, created pressures and temperatures at the point of impact that exceeded the structural limits of the steel. The face-hardened outer layer, which would have shattered a softer steel projectile, was overcome by the tungsten's superior hardness. The core penetrated through the hard outer layer and into the softer interior steel. The armor plate, stressed beyond its capacity, failed. Inside the Tiger, the crew experienced the penetration as a catastrophic event compressed into milliseconds. The driver, seated in the front left of the hull, was closest to the impact point. He heard the strike first, a sound like a massive hammer blow against an anvil, amplified by the enclosed steel space. Then he felt heat. The tungsten core, having penetrated the outer armor, was still traveling at high velocity through the interior of the tank. The projectile path took it through the driver's compartment at an angle, missing the driver by inches. It struck the transmission housing, a massive block of cast steel positioned in the center front of the hull. The tungsten core fragmented on impact with the transmission, sending fragments and spalling steel throughout the crew compartment. The driver felt impacts on his legs and back. Fragments of the projectile and interior armor plating ricocheted through the confined space. The radio operator seated to the driver's right was struck by spalling fragments. The commander, standing in the turret, felt the entire tank shudder from the impact. He looked down into the crew compartment and saw smoke, heard the driver screaming, saw the radio operator slumped in his seat. The transmission was leaking oil. The engine continued running, but the Tiger was immobilized. The German commander made the only rational decision. He ordered the crew to abandon the tank. The driver, wounded but mobile, extracted himself from his position. The radio operator required assistance. The gunner and loader in the turret bailed out through the turret hatches. The commander was last out, following doctrine that required the tank commander to ensure all crew escaped before abandoning the vehicle himself. From Bates's position 800 yards away, the result was visible but not immediately conclusive. He saw the impact, saw smoke begin to rise from the Tiger's engine deck, saw the turret hatches open and crew members emerge. He did not know if his round had penetrated or merely damaged external components. His instinct, trained through months of combat, was to fire again. But he held fire when he saw the crew abandoning the vehicle. There was no military necessity to kill men who were no longer a threat. The engagement lasted approximately 15 seconds from first sight of the Tiger to the crew bailout. 3 other German tanks in the area, positioned in supporting positions, withdrew after observing the Tiger's fate. They did not know what had happened, but they had seen a Tiger destroyed by frontal fire from a Sherman, something that was not supposed to be possible. The after-action report filed by Lieutenant Colonel Abrams noted the engagement tersely. 1 Tiger destroyed by frontal shot from 76mm gun at estimated 800 yards range. Crew abandoned vehicle. HVAP ammunition confirmed effective. The report was forwarded through channels to Toulon Corps Headquarters, then to 3rd Army, then to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Ordnance officers read it with intense interest. The hypervelocity ammunition worked in combat, not just on test ranges, but the more significant reaction came from German intelligence officers who debriefed the Tiger crew after they returned to German lines. The crew reported that an American Sherman's had penetrated their frontal armor at long range, something that had never occurred in their experience or in any engagement they knew about. The report was initially treated with skepticism. Perhaps the crew had misidentified the range. Perhaps they had been struck by a different weapon, an anti-tank gun rather than a tank. Perhaps they had exaggerated the circumstances to explain the loss of their vehicle. The skepticism evaporated over the following weeks as additional reports arrived. On October 2nd, near Moyenvik, another Tiger was penetrated frontally by American tank fire at ranges exceeding 700 yards. On October 7th, near Chateau Salin, a Panther was destroyed by frontal penetration. The pattern was undeniable. American tanks had acquired a weapon capable of defeating German heavy armor from the front at combat ranges. German tactical doctrine began to shift immediately. Tigers and Panthers, which had been positioned hold down in forward defensive positions with the assumption of frontal immunity, were pulled back to secondary positions where they could engage at longer ranges or from covered positions that did not rely solely on armor protection. The fundamental calculation that had governed German armored defensive tactics, that heavy tanks could absorb frontal fire and destroy attackers methodically, no longer held. The engagements at Aracourt in late September and early October 1944 represented more than isolated tactical successes. They represented the end of a strategic assumption that had governed armored warfare on the Western Front since the Tiger's introduction 2 years earlier. German commanders could no longer rely on frontal armor immunity for their heavy tanks. This forced a fundamental recalculation of defensive doctrine. The immediate German response was tactical withdrawal. Tigers and Panthers that had been positioned in forward defensive lines, expecting to dominate sectors through firepower and protection, were pulled back to positions that offered concealment and cover in addition to armor. Villages, forests, and reverse slope positions became preferred over open hull-down positions behind walls or earthworks. The tanks were now used as mobile reserves rather than static defensive anchors, positioned to respond to American penetrations rather than prevent them. This tactical shift had operational consequences. German defensive lines became more permeable. American armored units, previously forced to maneuver carefully and accept heavy losses when encountering Tigers or Panthers in prepared positions, could now advance more aggressively. The psychological advantage that German heavy armor had provided, the knowledge that American tanks could not harm them frontally, evaporated. German crews now knew they were vulnerable. They fought more cautiously. They withdrew more readily. They requested air support and artillery more frequently. American armor commanders recognized the change.
Immediately, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams noted in a report dated October 15th that German armor was behaving differently, withdrawing from positions that they would have defended aggressively in previous engagements. He attributed this to the increased effectiveness of American tank guns, and specifically to the availability of hypervelocity ammunition, though he noted that supply remained critically limited. The supply issue was not trivial. Through October to November 1944, each 76mm Sherman in the European theater received approximately 4 to 8 hypervelocity rounds per month as replacement ammunition. This was insufficient for sustained operations. Tank commanders hoarded the rounds, using them only against confirmed heavy armor targets. Standard armor-piercing ammunition remained the primary load for most engagements. The scarcity created inequality between units. Divisions with priority access to supplies, typically those involved in active offensive operations, received more hypervelocity ammunition. Divisions in defensive sectors or reserve positions received minimal allocations. This meant that the tactical advantage provided by the 76mm gun with hypervelocity ammunition was not uniformly available across the front. Some Sherman crews fought with weapons that could penetrate Tiger armor. Others fought with the same limitations that had existed since Normandy. German intelligence officers tracked American ammunition usage through examination of destroyed American tanks and through interrogation of prisoners. They noted the presence of tungsten core ammunition and recognized its significance. Reports forwarded to higher headquarters assessed that American industrial capacity would eventually overcome the tungsten scarcity, that hypervelocity ammunition would become standard issue, and that German armored doctrine would need permanent revision. These assessments were accurate. By December 1944, American production of hypervelocity ammunition had increased substantially. Monthly allocation to frontline units doubled, then tripled. By January 1945, during the Battle of the Bulge and its aftermath, 76mm Shermans routinely carried 15 to 20 hypervelocity rounds as part of their standard combat load. The weapon that had been experimental in June, scarce in September, and limited in October was becoming commonplace by winter. The
The psychological impact on German tank crews was documented through prisoner interrogations and captured documents. A Tiger commander captured near Bastogne in January 1945 told American intelligence officers that his crew had been instructed to avoid frontal engagements with American armor whenever possible, to maneuver for flank shots or withdraw if flanking was not feasible. This represented a complete reversal of previous doctrine, which had emphasized aggressive frontal engagement,
using armor protection as the primary defense. Another prisoner, a Panther driver captured in the Rhineland in February 1945, stated that his training in December had included specific instruction about American 76mm guns and hypervelocity ammunition. He had been told that frontal armor on the Panther was no longer reliable protection, that American guns could penetrate at ranges up to 1,000 meters, and that survival depended on not being hit rather than on armor alone. This was a profound shift in German tactical thinking. The story of the 76mm gun and its hypervelocity ammunition cannot be separated from the industrial capacity that produced it. The weapon existed because American factories could manufacture it in quantity. The ammunition existed because American access to strategic materials, particularly tungsten, allowed specialized production even during total war mobilization. Consider the production figures. From January through December 1944, American factories produced 4,137 Sherman tanks, mounting the 76mm gun. This was concurrent with continued production of 75mm Shermans, production of tank destroyers, production of light tanks, and production of all other military equipment. The Detroit tank arsenal alone operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Peak monthly production exceeded 500 tanks. The workers who built these tanks were largely women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before the war. They welded armor plate, assembled transmissions, installed guns, and performed every task required to transform raw steel into functioning combat vehicles. The quality control was rigorous. Each tank was test-fired, test-driven, and inspected before acceptance. Defects were corrected immediately. The production line did not stop. The ammunition production was equally impressive. Hypervelocity 76mm rounds required tungsten carbide cores, which had to be manufactured to precise specifications. The tungsten was mined in the United States, primarily in Colorado and California. Refined, processed into carbide, formed into cores, assembled into projectiles, loaded into cartridge cases, and shipped to Europe. The entire supply chain operated at maximum capacity. By comparison, German production of tungsten core ammunition for their own anti-tank guns was severely constrained by late 1944. Allied bombing had disrupted German tungsten imports from Spain and Portugal. Strategic reserves were depleted. German production of tungsten core ammunition for the 88mm Mk.IV anti-tank gun, which could have been used in Tigers and Panthers, was approximately 1/10 of American production of comparable ammunition. This meant that even if German guns were theoretically capable of defeating American armor at long range, with special ammunition, the ammunition was not available in sufficient quantity to matter tactically. The industrial disparity extended to every aspect of armored warfare. American tanks carried radios in every vehicle, enabling coordinated operations. German tanks often lacked radios in individual vehicles, relying on visual signals. American tanks received regular maintenance, with replacement parts shipped from the United States and distributed through an extensive logistics network. German tanks frequently lacked spare parts, with crews cannibalizing destroyed vehicles for components. American crews received replacement tanks when theirs were destroyed. A Sherman knocked out on Monday might be replaced by Wednesday, with a new tank delivered from rear area depots. German crews whose tanks were destroyed often had no replacement.
They might be reassigned to infantry units or sent to training depots to await new production that never arrived. The story of Staff Sergeant James Bates and his crew at Aracourt illustrates this disparity on a human level. Bates survived the war. His Sherman, No. 304, was hit twice by German anti-tank fire in November near Metz. The crew bailed out without casualties. Within 4 days, Bates had a replacement Sherman and was back in combat. The German Tiger commander whose tank Bates destroyed in September was less fortunate. His crew was reassigned to infantry duty. He never received another tank. By December, he was serving as a rifleman in a Volksgrenadier division. He was captured in January near the German border and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Kansas. These individual stories, multiplied across thousands of tank crews on both sides, reveal the true nature of industrial warfare. It was not primarily about individual courage or tactical skill, though both mattered. It was about systems, production capacity, resource access, and the ability to sustain operations over time. The American system could absorb losses and continue fighting. The German system could not. The Tiger commander at Aracourt, who ordered his crew to abandon their tank after it was penetrated by a Sherman's 76mm gun, experienced something more profound than tactical defeat. He experienced the collapse of a fundamental assumption. His armor, which had protected him through previous engagements, which had been the foundation of his survival and his effectiveness, had failed. The calculations that had governed his tactical decisions, the knowledge that American tank guns could not harm him frontally, were suddenly invalid. This psychological shift, repeated across hundreds of German tank crews through late 1944 and into 1945, represented the erosion of German confidence in armored warfare. The Tiger and the Panther had been more than weapons. They had been symbols of German technological superiority, proof that German engineering could produce machines that
Allied industry could not match. When American guns began penetrating Tiger armor, the symbolism shattered along with the steel. The irony is that German armor was still, in many respects, superior to American armor on a tank-for-tank basis. The Tiger's 88mm gun remained more powerful than the Sherman's 76mm. The Panther's sloped armor was more efficient than the Sherman's vertical plates. But superiority in individual vehicle performance mattered less than superiority in production, logistics, and sustained operations. Germany could not replace its losses. America could. The 76mm gun with hypervelocity ammunition did not make the Sherman equal to the Tiger or Panther in all respects. It made the Sherman adequate. It removed the Tiger's invulnerability. It allowed American crews to engage German heavy armor frontally without accepting certain defeat. That was sufficient. Combined with numerical superiority, better logistics, air superiority, and artillery support, adequacy was enough to win. For the American crews who operated these weapons, the experience was different but equally significant. They had entered combat in France with equipment they knew was inferior to German heavy armor. They had been trained to avoid frontal engagements, to maneuver for flank shots, to accept that Tigers and Panthers were superior machines. The 76mm gun with hypervelocity ammunition changed this calculus. It did not make them superior, but it made them competitive. They could fight German heavy armor on something approaching equal terms. The psychological impact was substantial. Crews who had felt outmatched, who had approached every engagement with heavy German armor, knowing they were at a disadvantage, gained confidence. They fought more aggressively. They took risks they had previously avoided. This shift in combat behavior was as important as the technical improvement in penetration capability. Warfare is fundamentally psychological. Soldiers who believe they can win fight differently than soldiers who believe they are outmatched. The story that began at a muddy crossroads near Ericourt in September 1944, with Staff Sergeant Bates engaging a Tiger from 800 yards with a weapon he had barely trained on, was ultimately a story about the collision between doctrine and reality. German doctrine said Tigers were immune to American tank fire from the front. Reality said otherwise. The tungsten core projectile that penetrated that Tiger's glacis plate did more than destroy a single tank. It destroyed an assumption, altered tactical calculations across the Western Front, and contributed to the erosion of German defensive capability in the final months of the war. By April 1945, when the war in Europe was entering its final weeks, the 76mm gun was standard on the majority of American medium tanks in the theater. Hypervelocity ammunition was no longer scarce. American crews engaged German armor confidently, knowing their weapons were adequate for the task. German crews, when they had operational tanks at all, fought defensively, withdrew frequently, and abandoned vehicles at higher rates than in previous years. The transformation was complete. What had been a weapon of questionable effectiveness in June 1944 had become the standard anti-armor tool by April 1945. What had been a scarce experimental round had become common ammunition. What had been a German tactical advantage, frontal immunity for heavy armor, had become a historical artifact. The industrial capacity and material resources of the United States had overcome German technological advantages through volume production and sustained supply. The lesson for those who study armored warfare and industrial conflict is clear. Individual weapon superiority matters less than systemic capacity to produce, supply, maintain, and replace equipment. The Tiger was a superior tank to the Sherman in many respects, but Germany could not produce enough Tigers, could not supply them adequately, could not replace them when destroyed. America produced adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers, supplied them efficiently, and replaced losses immediately. Adequacy multiplied by abundance defeats superiority constrained by scarcity. For the men who fought in these machines, the lesson was more immediate and personal. Your survival depended less on the quality of your equipment than on the competence of your crew, the tactics you employed, the support you received, and sometimes simple luck. The best tank in the world would not save you if your logistics failed, if your air support was absent, if your artillery was inadequate, or if you were outnumbered 10-1. The adequate tank, properly supported, properly supplied, and properly employed, would allow you to complete your mission and return home. That knowledge, hard-won through months of combat and verified through the penetration of Tiger armor at Ericourt and hundreds of other engagements across Europe, was perhaps the most important lesson of armored warfare in World War II. It was a lesson written in tungsten and steel, learned at muddy crossroads and in burning tanks, and paid for with the lives of men who trusted their equipment to protect them and discovered, sometimes fatally, the limits of that protection. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.